Hopefully that's good. Yep, great. Okay, well, as Jenny mentioned, my name's Samir, and today what we're going to talk about is, why organizations currently are experiencing some major significant challenges, in the area of data and AI. So let's just go to the agenda very quickly. So what I want to do is to set the scene and talk about some of the challenges that currently that I've seen in organizations where they're being where their problems are and how they are going to set about fixing those issues, but really with operating models, and why operating models are required in this day and age for the types of things that are coming to us right now with generative AI, and no doubt the sophisticated LLMs that are going to get even more sophisticated as we get into next year. So but there's some foundational things that we have to worry about first before we get into the fully blown AI world, and that's really the data analytics piece as well. So what I want to do is just go through what an operating model is, the types of operating models, a success story, and then give you 3 takeaways around what you need to do to choose the right operating model for your organization, and hopefully we'll have some Q&A as well. So it was good of Jenny to do a quick introduction, and I thought I'd just do a little fun introduction for myself. I live in London, as you can see in the top left hand or right hand for you. I've worked at a number of large corporates over my career: CSC, Accenture, Christie's, and a company called Vertex. And now I run DataZoom, which is a data strategy and analytics company, and we work with clients all across the globe. Almost all across the globe, I say. So UK, US, Europe, and now the Middle East. And that little thing behind my below my face is something that I created called the Data Strategy Canvas, and that I created in 2014, which really helps organizations build out their data strategies through a very, very simple tool. And there you'll see me waving my hands doing this with I am a charity auctioneer as well, and you'll see below a picture of a woman holding a very large white Tuscan truffle, and I sold the largest white Tuscan truffle in 2007 for charity for $330,000. So just some fun facts about me. Let's get on to the more serious things now that you're all here for. So where are we in the whole realm of data analytics and AI? A lot of companies have been doing it for a while. It's generally I remember being thrust into data in 2002. That was when I first fell into data, as a lot of people, a lot of my colleagues often do. And from that period, from 2002 until now, there is still some similarities that I can put my finger on around some of the challenges that organizations are having. Now, there's a litany of challenges, not just around talent, but one of the larger challenges right now for a lot of organizations is around change management and cultural shift. So how do we start to change the organization mindset? How do we start change the ways of working and really embrace that kind of data-informed decision making? We've all heard of breaking down silos. I don't need to harp on about that, because there's still a lot of silos that I see and my team sees in organizations. How do we measure ROI and aligning KPIs? I spoke to an organization yesterday which had over 3,000 KPIs, and so you start to wonder, how can somebody run their business on such a large extensive set of KPIs? So thinking about how to consolidate and maximize the efficiencies across that. Scalability and performance is still, I often hear, how do we scale data analytics and AI? How do we start to embed it across all of our organization? And fundamentally, that's something that we'll be talking about today. And obviously, now with AI coming more to the fore, and with things like ChatGPT, we have different concerns around ethics, around misinformation, So how do we start to mitigate those, areas and really factor that into what we do? I won't be going into too much depth in that, but I think around the operating models, we can discuss that. And then the age-old problem of data quality, and how it's, still poor in many companies, and really the limitations that it brings when you do want to do very advanced analytics, or go into the realms of AI. So those are some of the challenges that I've seen across organizations, and but there are still there's still problems. Let's not get ahead of ourselves in terms of we're really not out of the deep right now, and this is what puzzles me, I think. At this year's Gartner's Data and Analytics Summit, this was quite an interesting statistic that came out. And to think that, out of 500 companies that they reviewed, only 6% had true data strategies. And the biggest factors that were missing were an operating model and the business motivation. So both of those areas are, in my opinion, the largest and single most success factors in terms of delivering on data strategy, delivering the right data to the right people at the right time in order for them to digest that and make decisions, or if it's going into a decision system. So I believe these are probably things that we've overlooked, that organizations have overlooked, because a lot of the time what I see when I'm asked to go into organizations to either review or to create or to refresh their data strategies, I do often find that the operating model area is missing. And it's quite glaring, because for me, the operating model is the glue between the data strategy and really operationalizing the actual value and the business motivation. But it doesn't stop there, unfortunately. We've got some other factors here which are probably even bigger in terms of where organizations are right now. And New Vantage Partners, Randy Bean, does an annual survey. And in it, year on year, really the biggest impediment has been the fact that, cultural issues are creating the biggest obstacles to realizing business value. So you've got missing operating models, you've got lack of business motivation, and then you've got, the biggest obstacles around cultural issues and specifically change, business transformation, changes to organizational processes, people skills, organizational alignment, and communication. So that's something that I've seen over my career, and I got into the data strategy area in 2002, as I said, accidentally, coming from a business strategy background and then going to data strategy. But even since then, it's been a focal part of what I've been doing in terms of getting that change management and cultural factor to play into data strategy. So it's it still comes with its obstacles. It's still really difficult to change, in terms of organizational change. But I think there's ways to do it, and certainly operating models are the way, and the fundamental moves and shifts that we can make in order to have that impact.
Tamar, you got a question in the chat asking, if you go back to the slide, by expression, business motivation, do you mean purpose or something else? Can you explain that?
Yes. So business motivation would be, I think that the purpose is there of the business, but I think the actual, how do we connect the overarching data strategy to the business strategy? So it's really considering the fact that when I will look at a lot of data strategies, that there's a large part missing in terms of strategic objectives, and that's the business motivation. Why are we doing this thing? Often I see it's very much playing into a technology strategy. So I've seen data strategies that more lean towards technology rather than the pure business play. So that's where we come from. We come from a sort of business data strategy view. And that business motivation is really around those strategic objectives. And by strategic objectives, I mean specific areas such as we would like to increase revenue by X% by a certain time. And that's really specific. So, you know, oftentimes I see that missing, and one either has to try and get that out of the executives or try and unpick it from various documents, you know, quarterly reports, etc. So it's part and parcel of really building a business data strategy, as I said, and I hope that answers the question. And thank you for the question, whoever asked it. Sorry. So one of the fundamental questions that I get asked all the time is, look, you know, it's great that we've got this thing called data. Now we've got analytics, and oh my God, AI's turned up. And how do we scale this stuff? How do we build it, you know, pragmatically, and how do we leverage it so that we really embed it into the core practice of our business? That's really a fundamental question, and it's not about having teams that are sitting on the side, really crunching away and doing, you know, building algorithms or building lovely dashboards or building, you know, pipelines of data. It's really about how do we embed ourselves in the business. So, you know, an operating model, I'm going to get to that in a minute. In order for us to really answer this question, it's where the rubber hits the road. And, you know, just as a simple way of understanding what an operating model is, it's really just a collection of capabilities. And that collection of capabilities is aligned around things like structure, collaboration, ways of working, innovation. And I believe that those are the hallmarks of the criteria that we need to get set around the operating model. And it's often, as I said, missed. It's something that's not really talked about. So, you know, from my perspective, the components are, again, pretty simple in terms of what an operating model is. And the way that I look at it, the framework that I use, and a specific way that I talk about an operating model is, the operating model is how your strategy is made real. It's as simple as that. And that's why, you know, some companies really miss it, because I think they're too focused and worried on specific areas like, let's build a data platform, or let's get the algorithm spun up and let's start testing it. Whereas if you don't have an operating model, an organization, you don't have the people and the processes around that, technology is fine, but it's you know, it's probably about the easiest thing, to be fair. The other areas are far more difficult to implement. It takes time. It takes people to change their ways of working or some of their behaviors, and that's not easy from an organizational context. So luckily, I'm you know, I'm also an organizational psychologist, you know, by doing a master's in that, which was quite amazing, starting to think about how organizations live and breathe. But really, the way I look at this is in 4 areas. You need the talent in order to be able to drive out what you need to do from a business strategy perspective. That talent needs to access the right systems and processes in order to do their jobs. And by talent, I don't mean just technical resources. I mean across the board, in terms of people who are going to be doing those, building those capabilities, but equally people who are going to be leveraging those capabilities. And that talent needs to be upskilled. That talent needs to have an understanding of how to use these capabilities. And therefore, how do we use data? Where do we get it from? How do we access it? This is not just a technical play here. And the system and the talent needs that access to systems and processes, as well as it needs to understand the governance factors. So I could take any one of those areas and say, well, you know, talent has a connection with data because it needs to be leveraged. Talent needs to understand the governance of how we absolutely build data products, or start to engineer pipelines, or start to get dashboards into the hands of users, or start to bring algorithms out and into decision systems. And systems and processes are required. But what we typically also have are these vertical and horizontal factors. And within an operating model, we always have a business strategy. So we're leaning into the business strategy, we're driving that, and that's the operationalization, making the strategy real. And from a data strategy and analytics perspective, we have this thing called data and AI vision, typically built up around as a dependency on the business vision, on the mission of that organization, so that there's always a link rather than having it abstracted from that. And therefore, we can always bind the data strategy or the data and analytics strategy or the data and AI strategy, whatever you want to call it, we can always bind that to the business strategy as our North Star. And then on the rest of that horizontal, on the rest of that vertical, horizontal is the value piece. So the operating model is how we're going to be driving value. How do we get from that vision to value, and using all those capabilities that are in those 4 boxes in order to do that? And not forgetting that we've got to, while we've got strategy, we've got operations as well. We're driving operations, we're optimizing the organization for efficiencies, and we're trying to also get value from there. But pure value in terms of that might be revenue, it might be customer. So there's different sides of the coin in terms of value. So the systems and processes, they also need governance. They need talent to understand them, and data flows through all of those systems and processes all the time. So we need to understand those. We need to map them out. We need to know which process is going to be triggered by which data. Where are the handoffs? How do we understand the value exchange between us and our customers? And that's that value piece. And therefore, we're driving out always trying to think of this holistic view rather than piecemeal and siloed, which is where lots of organizations are now. And therefore, governance. Governance has an understanding of the systems that are in place. Governance, it needs to drive those systems and processes, and it needs to drive the talent and data. And by governance here, I talk about AI and data governance, because now we've got a new lens on top of governance. It's no longer just data governance, but AI governance, ethics, bias, and we really need to factor all of those areas into it. And then obviously the data needs to be a focal point here. Now, this is really where we believe a lot of people miss out on understanding what an operating model is. And therefore, you may have already in your organizations, you may have plenty of types of operating models. But there's typically, what we'll find is there's about 4 major operating models that are out there.
So and we have a question in the chat about,
yes, of course,
going back to kind of the operating model and the talent. Yes. Who do you see, or what kind of position will be the right position to create the processes and oversee the whole process? Right.
So from an operating model perspective, if it's the implementation of that data and AI strategy, data and analytics strategy, then typically it's going to be the people that I've worked with, and it varies. The most recent operating model we've implemented, I was working alongside the Chief Data Officer. And the Chief Data Officer was the person who was absolutely driving that. We helped them to configure, put the processes in place, understand the workflow and optimization, building out the organization, and working with their organization to understand what cultural shifts and barriers there were. So, from that example, it was the CDO, Chief Data Officer. But from another example, I worked with the CIO. So the Chief Information Officer. It's just because they didn't have a CDO in their business, and the CIO is the de facto person responsible for data. So whoever's, I would say, whoever maintains an understanding or drives data in an organization should really be driving this out, but working with other executives. And it doesn't really just fall flat on that person. It's always got to be with in a collaborative sense, and they've got to have that in mind as they start to work, because you can't implement an operating model without having that collaboration across the executives and then the operational teams. So it's really important that while it's great having a chief data officer or a chief analytics officer or a chief data and analytics officer, or even now the chief AI officer, typically, if there is one, then they should be responsible for this.
And a follow-up on your
Yes.
answer here. There's
Yes.
a question about what is the role of Chief Data Officer? Is it a new thing that just got invented because everyone's looking at AI and data now? What are your thoughts on that? What are the responsibility of
is that the question? What is the role of the Chief Digital Officer? Is that the one?
That's right. Yes.
Oh, right, the Chief Digital. Yeah. So the Chief Digital Officer. Well, I think, you know, most organizations before the pandemic really didn't. Well, we heard all about digital transformation and, you know, digitizing processes, making sure we're moving away from manual ad hoc processes and moving into a more sort of digitized based processes. Now, the Chief Digital Officer was absolutely paramount to building that out. They were the person that would lead the organization, whether that was from a web-based process or an internal-based process that was a paper-based and needed to move into a digitized process. So you know, I think the Chief Digital Officer. Let's. I don't know when the Chief Digital Officer emerged actually, but the Chief Data Officer actually emerged in 2002. So I was the first Chief Data Officer emerging for Capital One, I believe, in the US. The Chief Digital Officer was probably a much later title and probably a newer title, although I must say the Chief Data Officer probably didn't become didn't come to the fore probably until about 10 or 12 years ago, really, in terms of, you know, having that impact in organizations and people starting to talk about that. So I think Chief Data Officer came first and then the Chief Digital Officer. And there are times where the Chief Digital Officer, I certainly worked with an organization where the Chief Digital Officer was the person who was responsible for data. But they were also hiring a person who was going to be their head of data, who would have then taken that role on. So, you know, it is a new role, newish, but the Chief Data Officer probably outdates it. Hopefully I answered that. Any more questions, Jenny?
Yes, we have a question on that's from Frank. He said, I heard you mention the word structure. Learned that many organizations use a hierarchical structure. In your experience, what other ways of organizing can help create even more value?
Great question, Frank. Yes, hierarchical is obviously used in many organizations, command and control, or whatever you want to call it. But flatter structures are coming in. But what I'm going to do is, when I go through the case study that I'm going to take you through, that actually it talks to a very different kind of structure that organizations can use. It was the first time I came across this particular structure, and I don't want to give it away yet. So if you're just patient, Frank, that'd be great. Thank you. Okay, so the sorry, did I move on too quickly? Yeah, so I was just talking about the different types of operating models, and typically this is where most people start. They start with having a centralized operating model where they can, you know, they're just starting their journey. A lot of organizations that are less mature than others will start here. That, you know, and the reasons why is that they don't have a big workforce in terms of the data analytics and AI team. They're either trying to explore what kind of services they need to provide to internally to the organization, as well as externally. And here, what we find is that, you know, the consistency factor is around, you know, the processes around data management and analytics. You know, they're more standardized and they're more consistent in terms of, you know, either reporting or decision making. So everything, you know, can be more focused here. It's efficient because the resources, you know, we'll be looking at data storage, processing, personnel management, rather than, you know, and it's more confined to a bunch of people who are in a defined organization, and there's, because of the centralized view, there's more control over things like data governance, security, and compliance. So you can actually factor that in a central fashion, and then the expertise bit is really around centralized teams, and they have deep expertise in specific domains. So you could essentially have centralized teams, and a few of those teams would just be responsible for a specific domain. And they start to get that specific expertise. But unfortunately, there's quite a few bottlenecks here. Requests, can often get stuck. People aren't getting responded to because, that single flow point, people are overwhelmed in those teams. There's a lot more expected of them. It's less adaptable sometimes in terms of that specific or business unit when their needs change or the market changes. For example, if there's a fluctuation in something that's going on within the industry, it can impact this because they can't move as quick as possible. Because of the centralized focus, because of the processes are extremely rigid in that sense. Communication actually here is quite a problem. I've seen in many organizations where communication lacks. There's a view of being very internalized, and because these requests are coming in, and I often find myself using this term, that a lot of these teams who are centralized are pure order takers. So there's a lot of orders coming in, and literally they're just sitting there trying to get these things done because the time pressures are on there, and therefore communication really doesn't make its way back to the rest of the organization. And then again, because of that, many people can be overwhelmed, mainly because of the amount of stuff that's coming to them. And therefore, that again leads to delays and the risk of people, burning out and so on. So I think, you can start with this, but very quickly we've got to find different ways to move away or bolster these teams in order to help them scale. And going back to that question, how do we scale these factors? So, a decentralized really is, starting to distribute people across the organization, starting to push them down into various business units or departments, and then giving them some autonomy. And again, this provides us with a really good view of, okay, now we get closer to the business. Now we're able to respond a lot quicker instead of being, this sort of centralized team. That's where we can start to understand local business needs. That's where we can get a little bit more ownership in terms of how the business responds to data. One of the factors that I constantly hear people talk about in most data teams is that the business doesn't take enough ownership. But having this, sometimes you're closer to the business, you can actually speak to them a lot more. They understand and observe the challenges that the data team has, and then they really start to understand what those are and start to foster more accountability in terms of taking that ownership and really understanding what their role is. So that mindset shift does start to shape and start to take change as well, which is good. Those teams obviously are going to be domain specific or business unit specific, so they become very heavy experts in that area, which allows them to respond much quicker to requests and much quicker to insights and understanding the business, rather than being very separated and just providing a dashboard, which most of the data team and the centralized team really don't know why the users are using it, or for what purpose or decision making they're going to be driving. So it's got some, obviously each of these has got their cons. And data silos is a big thing here, because the more that we decentralize, and I think back to things like data democratization, which came out of the first revolutionary BI tools, I would say, moving away from those GUI type of business intelligence tools, where people could get their hands on something like ClickView or Tableau, where they would be able to bring in data and start to visualize data and so on. But again, what that democratization did was it gave them a false sense around that they could do this very quickly and do it with the right data. And unfortunately, because they were bringing data from every single area, it was not checked. There were challenges with that data in terms of the accuracy, and therefore they were probably making the wrong decisions with the data that they had mashed up with other types of data, and really making their own insights around that. So that led to inconsistencies around data quality as well, because the standards were slightly less so, not centrally backed now, and more, more decentralized. So people were beginning to say, oh, we'll just bring this data and put it into a platform that we've got, and we'll start to analyze it without the rigor behind that sort of data management structure and discovery piece that we should be doing. And again, security risks, things around data loss, data leakage. Because it's out at the edge, people don't necessarily know that they've got it on their laptop, or they do, but it's not really being looked at in a secure manner. And then duplicated efforts, so duplication of tools, duplication of data, duplication of processes, and again, inefficiencies that strike right at the heart of most organizations. So the other one that I often see now being talked about is the hub and spoke, which really is around having that a mix between centralized and decentralized, and having those core functions in the center playing a role in terms of the control functions, the governance factors, building pipelines, making sure that we can start to get the data in a good state in order for those people in the spokes to start to use that for more analytical processing, more insight gathering. But again, because they're right in the business functions, they're able to really, be nimble and agile in terms of that collaborative view. So again, things, striking that balance between the central and decentral teams, having more efficiencies in terms of that central control over, and offering that sort of innovation and flexibility down at the spoke level. And then again, that collaboration, because both teams speak to each other when they've got problems. The analytics team or the local spoke team may be onboarding data, they're more likely to speak to the central team because there's standards in place. When they onboard data, they know it's got to be done in a particular way. There's got to be a validation and so on, and therefore that lends itself to better processing and understanding, and then better usage of data and quality. And so that that's obviously about the standardization as well. But there are some things around complexities. And I think it's just managing that central versus decentral, and making sure you really do have tight coupling of processes and standards between the two, and they understand that, and they really know who to speak to and when about specific challenges or issues. And resource allocation can often be, it might be resource heavy at the analytics side down in the spokes, but resource light in the central team. So again, you're going to have a bit of a lag between requests or understanding how to process data or governance areas and so on. And then again, potential for silos, because if it's not managed properly, data silos can still emerge. But more or less, this is probably one of the models that we do often see. And the final one I'm going to talk about is just really the federated view. And a lot of people will start associating federated with things like data mesh or data fabric, and how that particular model will be, looking at a more of a federated side where data and analytics is pushed right into the departments. Everybody's got their own data and analytics team, and obviously AI as they start to emerge with that. There's a lot more autonomy in this. There is always going to be a very small centralized team here, and there's because of that significant autonomy down at the federated level. Those central teams can sometimes be overlooked. So but the flexibility still stays with, the federated teams. They've got their own data governance in place sometimes. They've also got, their own tools. They might be sharing data, but again, there's going to be problems around coordination challenges with data governance, again, resource duplication, and the potential for inefficiencies around that. So one has to have a clear balance between what the purpose is of each of these operating models and where we potentially see ourselves on a journey and the evolution of these particular operating models being applied to your organization. Now, when I do go into organizations, often there's so let's just go straight to a federated model. Well, actually, there's probably a kind of evolution that we would go through when we when we start these initiatives, when we start to put a data strategy together, when we start to think about implementing it. And so, you know, what I often will say to organizations is start with a centralized team. Think about how that's going to work. Think about your processes. Think about your standards. Think about actually just getting a team that really can work with each other and engaging with the business. So really understand what the business needs are and be able to speak the language of the business. Now, I've put something else in here, which is what I often see with organizations is when we take them from a centralized to a hub and spoke model, there's often this consulting piece in the middle. And that consulting piece is another operating model. I mean, I didn't put it on there. It's not one that's used very often. But the consulting pieces, the consulting operating model actually is a really good way, is a good segue between centralized to hub and spoke. Why? Because often the centralized teams have been so focused internally, so focused on getting the standards in place, so focused on getting a data platform in place, so focused on getting the processes in place, making sure there's policies, procedures, and so on around governance, that they really haven't been able to work close enough with the business functions. And that's why we often approach it in the way that we will build out a small consulting part of that centralized team to go out and speak more to the business. So as they start to understand the needs of each of those functions, they come back and see what's important for that hub and spoke. So what do they need in the spoke? Do they need types of resources? Do they need new systems? What kind of talent is there? And therefore, what kind of governance do they need as well? Going back to my quadrant of different of the components and capabilities that are required. And therefore, that's a much easier progression towards the hub and spoke. And then you can start to slowly, as you scale from the hub and spoke onwards, then you can start to build out into a federated. But most people I see will stop at the hub and spoke because it works for them well. They've got enough control. They've got enough collaboration. They understand efficiency, and they've got the processes in place in order to speak, to have the glue between the hub and the spoke. And then, you know, as they start to optimize, as they start to think about, you know, more what I would say is AI and innovation at the edge, maybe that's when they start to become federated. But this is where I believe that we're heading to. I believe that all of them can coexist, and the reason I'm saying this is because AI is beginning to emerge as a fundamental practice for organizations. It's going to be a capability, as a technology capability, if some people want to call it that, but it's got to be seen from an innovation perspective. So part of my thinking and my approach speaking to organizations is have data management, have the core capabilities, what I call the foundational capabilities in the central team, have them looking at standard operating procedures, have them looking at, you know, the governance and the policies and the procedures, make sure they can align to the organization and the values and the culture of the organization, really embed that practically, and have those people being able to respond to the analytics hub and spoke, which is really around what we, you know, term as insights driven, because they're closer to the business functions. They're day in, day out trying to, you know, work out what's happening in the business. Where are we going? Where are we heading? Are we actively working towards those strategic objectives? Are we actively hitting our numbers? Are we getting the salespeople to understand where the bottlenecks are in their sales process? Are we reaching and acquiring the right customers that we should be? Are we you know, if you're a charity, are we being able to receive the right funds from the right areas in order to help us prop up our projects? So there's lots of different ways that the analytics function in that is really down in those business functions, and that core data management, that foundational piece, supports them. The way that I see AI emerging in organizations is at the edge. And when I say at the edge, I see most of the AI being done now, say, for example, in hospitals or in F1, Formula One racing. It's being done right there and then. When someone's being scanned, AI kicks in, looks at the scan, is able to understand whether that person has a cancerous lump or is open, you know, the percentage factor that comes back is open to some kind of cancer, or you know, the Formula One racing driver is doing, you know, very second, you know, you know, making decisions in seconds, and you know, AI is being pushed out to that driver to make sure that that driver is getting the right information right there. So these are edge cases, I believe, and that's why I think AI sits right out in a sort of in a federated fashion, and that operating model should all work within the context of how you build it out within the organization. But the AI piece is really down at where do we need to optimize? Where do we need to automate? How do we need to make sure that we're actually providing a quick enough response to a customer that asks a question on our website through our new generative AI application, or you know, as an example. And then the thing that wraps it around, which I've been thinking about this for a long time, and data engineering as it emerged from data architecture and so on. But how do we start to stitch all of the relevant tools and systems and databases together in order for that pipeline to be built to help the innovation and automation, drive those insights, and make sure we create the wraparound foundational capabilities. And I think that data engineering, I call it data engineering as a service, sits on the peripheries, because it really hugs all of that and makes sure that those people are supported. So if this was a 3D model, I'd see data engineering as a service, you know, sort of at the bottom, but stacked into each of them. Yeah, I'm trying to do it in a 3D way here, but probably not getting my explanation right. But I think they can all coexist, and they can work together in that fashion. And I think organizations do need to think very differently around how they do approach this. And I'm going to go into a success story right now, which will help you understand the differences between, you know, the maturity aspects, the ways that organizations are thinking about this. And let's just go into a global financial services company, pretty big. They have, as it says, top 3 in 8 countries. They've got about, you know, 4.3 billion in estimated remaining collections. They're a debt recovery service. They manage over 473 million in portfolio, over 3,000 portfolios, and they've got about their cash income was just below $1 billion in the last 12 months. So it's a fairly sizable organization, you know. But again, they've been going for 40, 50 years. They've grown organically. They've acquired many organizations that. And through that acquisition process, they've onboarded many different systems, many different processes. Some of those haven't been integrated. So there's organizations that are sitting outside. There's data that sits outside, but data needs to be applied to most of the parts of the organizations. But so they had very similar challenges. A lot of when we started working with them, a lot of the business teams were saying they just didn't trust the data. They couldn't get access to the data when they needed it. Again, it takes too long to get to the insights. The hippo always wins the race, which is, you know, the highest paid person in the office. So that was a limiting factor. Again, they talked about no ownership across the business, and because they'd had teams which were effectively decentralized, there were multiple versions of data all over the place, and therefore, you know, those silos were incredibly distant from where they should be. And again, just giving you context, you know, that data was spread out everywhere in different systems. They weren't looking at this through a questions-based process, but they had a lot of different parts of the organization that were screaming for data continuously, and continuously having to either invest in a shadow BI function or a shadow analytics function, going out and buying their own applications, and not really speaking to a centralized team at all about how they should onboard, how they should, you know, work with data, what is, you know, what it means to build data models, how do they get the right architecture in place. So actually there was a lot missing. Data scientists were sitting in collection strategy. There were people doing model development in another department. There was a business process team that was just mapping business processes. a lot of it was siloed, and actually they needed to start to get their arms around it. But the main challenge for them was, how do we build an organization that is going to be able to service all of these different domains while being able to service not just the domains, but projects and programs, which was always a tricky piece of the pie. So sitting down with the chief data officer, we started to think about, an operating model. And as we started to whiteboard and start to think about the different, impacts on the business, the ways of working internally, the organizational culture, something emerged that actually I'd never thought about. And this was around bringing virtual teams together to be able to basically align them against particular processes and particular requests, and bring them from different parts of different teams that didn't really speak to each other that much. So again, thinking about the disparate nature of organizations, the disparate nature of teams, how do we start to bring teams together, but also bring the language together? So engaging with business teams in a lot more granular fashion. How do we start them to understand what processes are required from the data side, and how do we get the data teams to understand what processes are required from the business teams? So they had a very small bunch of teams, again, data governance team over here, a data engineering team over here, BI and data science resources that were decentralized, QA analysts, data warehouse developers. So as we started to unpick who these people were, they had some third-party people in place as well. How would we then look at the backlog? How would we start to put in a more rigorous endeavor to understand what's a priority, understand how we size that, understand the value and impact for the organization, understand the cost benefit, and then be able to absolutely have a seamless and transparent process that helps the organization understand how they can engage and speak that language. So that common language has to be a factor in here. And because I created the data strategy canvas, that canvas actually was the bridge between the technical teams and the business teams, because they all came onto a similar language that they could speak. And therefore that helped them to get through the idea of, I don't know what a database is, or I don't know what a widget is, or I don't know what a data model means, or I don't know how, I actually don't know what, EBITDA is, or I don't know, what that particular operational process is. So having them both understand each other through the data strategy canvas helped them to deliver a better approach to working and changing their mindset and cultural factors within the business. So really, I've talked about what the data squad was, but the mission, you can, bringing the benefits of a centralized and decentralized approach, thinking about that there were some decentralized teams and centralized teams. How do we start to get them to work closely together? How do we put the processes in place? What's the glue between those people? And then how do we start to really help getting data quality on top, understanding lineage? If there's going to be AI applications that are going to be needed by the legal team, what does that mean in terms of data quality and lineage? And therefore, how trustworthy can we provide that in a very transparent view? So those were some of the things that we did as well. And just moving into some of the approaches. Oh, it looks like one's missing. Sorry about that. The approaches and frameworks basically that we did was to look at an end-to-end engagement framework from the moment that there's an idea in the head of a business person to the end point where it's delivered to them. What did that look like in stages? How did we, a lot of times there were, I'd seen data products that have been delivered without a definition of a use case, without an understanding of cost benefit, without an understanding of what value it's going to actually provide. So we embedded that into the process. We put a demand management type of team together, which would help them manage that demand coming in and work with both business and technical teams to size it, to be transparent. And that data product scoring criteria actually help the business teams to understand what it takes when a request comes in. So now they start to think about, am I asking something that's really difficult? But before, all I wanted was, I want a question answered. How difficult is that for the technical teams? What's the business value behind that? And that was all embedded in the scoring criteria. And then the capability convergence model was all about understanding those 4 capabilities that are required from talent, from the structure and systems and processes, governance, and data, and really bringing that together to help the teams to understand how that operates. The governance framework, which is also a wider governance framework. So it's just not about technology or data. It is actually looking into risk and legal, because they're heavily regulatory compliant. So it's understanding that. Sorry, the business questions. There was we started to use the data strategy canvas to automate and put in workflow processes from request to actually being able to seamlessly understand what's coming in, who's going to be responding to it, who's going to be identifying that, and then who's the requester that we really need to speak to, because there's things that are missing, so that we can understand the business more. So the technical team started to understand that. And part of our process as well is very much embedding change management and comms into this. Now, change management isn't just about stakeholder management. This is about changing the way that our behaviors work, our cultural shifts in the organization. And there's lots of different techniques that you can use, and having a good communications approach is a must. And if there's one thing that I'd say to data teams, it's communicate, 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 because they don't do it enough. And so what were the benefits for the organization? Well, they got a new operating model in 4 months. It was implemented from start to finish. They got virtual teams in place. They got all the processes. They got all of their business teams embracing this new endeavor, and they got the technology that underpinned it. It is an investment. Luckily, they had the technology, and we were able to consolidate some specific technology stacks to make sure that we had a more seamless approach. They had the data quality that was trusted. It was more transparent. We could show and identify lineage from where a piece of data came in to where it landed in a report or in an algorithm, and you could see what sort of journey it took. Equally, you could see the data quality factors around that as well. So you could see, look, you're going to get this data product, but some of the data that sits underneath it is only 60%, we believe, good in terms of quality, in terms of completeness, timeliness, and different data quality metrics. Clarity in terms of the way that people would request, and the business working in a way that they can understand the language that they're requesting in, and it isn't technical language, it's business language, so that even the technical teams needed to understand that. Common language. Self-serve was always something that the business teams wanted to do, so we helped them towards that self-serve, so they could now start do a more of a self-serve capability in terms of, hey, I'm trying to answer this question. Has somebody tried to answer this question before? And there was a repository that we built. They could search for it, do a Google type search, and it would give them the closest match to them to answer that question, and they could then speak to that person to understand what their purpose was. So again, that was business functions speaking to each other. They get to understand what's happening, and they've got real good purpose between each other. So, because we consolidated platforms, there was a reduction in costs around licensing, and I believe that's going to be about 15 million over 3 years. And then there's more trustworthy data, so people were really happy to start using the service more. So the last thing that I'll talk about is, how do you choose? So most organizations are extremely they're all different. They're all on different paths in terms of maturity or capability levels. So one of the things I always do is to look at the organization and say, think about your culture. What is it? How do you work? What's your modus operandi? Are you more regulatory focused? Does that mean you need to have more central type of resources? What's the org structure? Is it regional versus local? Is it subsidiaries? An engineering firm we worked with had a very large global organization with subsidiaries, and therefore they had a small central team, but it was the Wild West across all of their other subsidiaries. And how do we kind of rein that back in? So looking at org structure is important, and also looking at the industry. What can are there going to be market changes? Are there going to be shifts coming up in the industry that are going to affect you? And then current capabilities. Strategy is important because you really need to align it with business objectives. What are they? and how are you going to arrive at those business objectives through a short, medium, and long term? And therefore, when you're thinking about that short term, yes, it's probably going to be a centralized team. More medium, you're going to try and move to more of that sort of hub and spoke. Long term, maybe it's federated, or you might stay at hub and spoke. And are you thinking about optimization? Where is that optimization going to happen? Is that going to happen downstream in your business at the customer end, or is it going to happen just internally? And these things do cost. You know, changing an organization, changing the way that data teams come together to work with the business. You got to think about the sponsorship, as somebody quite rightly mentioned earlier. You know, who runs it, who's the sponsor, and where does the budget sit? Does it sit centrally, or is it going to be with one of the business functions? And how well do you know what the business functions needs are? So those areas and elements are very important for you to understand how you're going to structure, how you're going to organize, and how you're going to implement this operating model, and how long it's going to take. In some instances, because the strategy is quite complicated, it could take, you know, as much as 3 years. Could be 5 years. In our case with the organization, the financial organization, it was pretty quick because we were able to move quite, it's one of our specialities in terms of what we do. So I'll stop there. I will thank you for attending. That's very kind of you to have patience with me, ask your questions, and they've been fantastic questions. Thank you very much.